Are you a CEO or senior leader looking to improve? Do you aspire to the C-suite and want to improve your odds for success both now and in the future? Or do you just want to build the right mindsets regardless of your leadership role? Whichever those apply to you, you are in the right place. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you're here live, we are so glad that you're here. And as I said to you before we started this recording, tell us hello and where you're coming from today. And while you're here, we want you to imagine that you're joining my guest and I, who I'll introduce in a second, and I for a cup of coffee. Just share your questions, your comments, and your ideas. That will all make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode too. Now, if you aren't here live and you're listening to this in the podcast, you could be here live in the future. Not for this one, but for future ones. And you can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see these sooner, like a lot sooner in this particular case, by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. You can simply go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Today's episode is brought to you by the newest podcast from our organization, the Long Distance Work-Life Podcast, hosted by Wayne Trammell, my co-author of both The Long Distance Leader and The Long Distance Teammate, and co-hosted by Marissa Eikenberry. Yes, she's my daughter-in-law. They will bring you the latest in tools, ideas, and insights to help you succeed in the ever-evolving future of work. You can subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts, where you're listening now, or at longdistanceworklife.com. So with all of that taken care of, I'm going to bring in my guest. He's here. Actually, I never had him leave. I think I screwed that up, everybody. Vic's been sitting here patiently waiting for me to introduce him. So let me do that, everybody. Our guest today is Vikram Malhotra. He is the senior partner in McKinsey's New York office and is the longest tenured member of the firm. He served on its board of directors for 13 years, its operating committee for 6, and on its senior partner committee for 5. He was also the managing partner for the Americas and currently chairs the firm's professional standards committee. Throughout his career, he has spent extensive time counseling CEOs and boards. He's also active with major nonprofits outside of McKinsey. He serves as the chairman of the board of the Wharton Graduate School, the University of Pennsylvania, and is the trustee in the New York City Partnership, trustee emeritus of the Asia Society, and many more. He's also the co-author of a new book. That's why he's here today. CEO Excellence, 6 Mindsets that Distinguish the Best Leaders from the Rest. And Vic, I'm so glad that you're here. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and I appreciate your very generous introduction. That was very nice of you. Thank you.
Let's see. We've got people here from Michigan and Florida and Texas and Seattle, more Michigan and Montreal and Poland. You get the prize for the furthest so far, Almer. And we've got Atlanta, Georgia, USA. And I'm sure we've got many more. So we're glad that all of you are here. Vic, I want to dive in with a question that I ask a lot of people here, because I think it's, I can introduce you and you can have a sense of that, right? And everyone can have a sense of who you are from that. But I think it's really interesting to learn a little bit more about your journey. So we don't need the full detailed bio, but sort of, you didn't probably wake up when you were 11 and say, hey, I want to be the longest tenured employee at McKinsey. Right. So thoughts, I mean, what sort of gets you to this point as you sort of are moving into the later stages of your career?
Well, I came to McKinsey very accidentally. I grew up in India, lived on the island of Cyprus for a number of years, was educated, went to college in London, worked in London. I don't tell many people this, so I'll tell everyone to cover their ears up. I was a boring accountant, with all due respect to any accountants out there. And I was looking for a change in career. And someone told me, this was back in the 80s, someone told me about this thing called the business school in the United States. So I applied. I had no idea what business schools were. I went to what turned out to be a fabulous one at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. And McKinsey recruited me out of there, and here I am. And it's been a fun journey. But having lived all over the world prior to landing in New York City, I've now lived here now for 36 years, which is pretty amazing to me. So that's just a little bit of the journey to this point.
Awesome. So Vic, you've co-written with a couple of your colleagues at McKinsey this really great new book called CEO Excellence. And so I'm going to open with this question, and it probably gives you the chance to talk a little bit about how you got to the people that led you to the book. But like, is it possible for us to determine CEO excellence, or I guess in this case, how did you guys go about doing that for this book?
Yeah, so we at McKinsey have always done a lot of research in terms of what creates and makes for excellent leaders and excellent CEOs for a while. We have a 20-year database on CEO performance numerically and also including some qualitative measures that we have. And my two co-authors and I came together and said, gee, we've seen a lot of books written on leadership. We've seen a lot of books written by CEOs on their own leadership, but we've never seen much that really looks across the CEO universe and says, for CEOs, what are some of the things that really stand out in terms of their leadership? So we actually sat down this path of looking at all of our research and saying, can we just find a way to publish it? And then we thought to ourselves, well, that's going to be pretty boring. Who's going to want to see a lot of facts and statistics, on CEO?
But you guys are good at that. I'm just saying.
Well, we are, but we were looking for a little bit of broader appeal here, and we kind of didn't quite see that. So we thought to ourselves, well, let's go interview some great CEOs. Now, we did use our analytical lens to define that because we essentially looked at this last, call it 25 years, this century, and said, we want to look at all the CEOs in that period of time. And there were roughly Fortune 1000 and bigger, probably about 3,500 CEOs or so. But we said we wanted people with 6 years of tenure or more, and for the most part, top quintile performance in their sector, as defined by shareholder return. And that quickly narrowed the group from 3,500 to 200 people, if you can imagine. So we got down to 200. We reached out to about 90 of them. 67 of them graciously agreed to be interviewed, many for multiple hours. So we were very fortunate to have lots and lots of great people spend real quality time with us to share their insights. So that's how we came to the book.
And as it turns out, in the back of the book, when you all get your copy, and here it is again, I'll show it to you again. When you get your copy, they're very transparent about who they talk to. Obviously, if you read the book, there's lots of stories about all the folks. Some of the names will be names you recognize. Some will be those that you don't. Doesn't really change the point. One of the things that you talk about early in the book, and I think, well, let me just step back and say, if you're listening to this podcast and you've listened before, or if you're joining us and you say, Kevin, you don't usually talk about CEOs necessarily. When I got the book, Vic, I said, CEOs themselves certainly isn't our only audience. So we're certainly going to talk today, everybody, about what they've learned about CEOs. And I'm confident, and we'll talk about it before we're done, how we translate that to any of us as leaders. And I think nearly all of this, with a few exceptions, applies to all of us. They're just
I'm sorry, not to interrupt you there.
Yeah.
Not to interrupt you there, Kevin, but absolutely. I think at the end of the day, this is a book about leadership. It is less a book about CEO leadership. It's geared in the lessons learned from excellent CEOs, but I think very, very applicable. And we can come back and talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but there's one of the things, I think a lot of times those who aren't in the C-suite, haven't worked with people in the C-suite like you and I have, people say, well, they got there. They're obviously very successful to get there. So like, is there a proven process to sort of create or guarantee CEO success? I mean, you quickly went, when you started taking a couple of quick slices, you cut 3,500 to 200 pretty quickly. Like, what do we know about how to do this for future CEOs?
Yeah. So there were three things that really stood out. Item one was what you find with these CEOs. By the way, what we did do as part of this book was define the 6 responsibilities of CEOs. This is true of all CEOs, regardless of whether you're remarkable or not.
Right.
All CEOs have these 6 roles, right? But the 3 things that stood out was, the first thing was, all of the excellent CEOs could do all 6 of these things really well. My co-author likes to liken these CEOs to the best decathletes in the world. He often says to me, Vic, you've never heard of Ashton Eaton, have you? Ashton Eaton turns out to be truly one of the world's most remarkable athletes, perhaps even in many ways the very best athlete the world's ever seen, because he's been so good at so many disciplines at the same time. So my co-author likes to say the best decathletes is what great CEOs are. They can spin all 6 of these roles at the same time, as opposed to, you're the Michael Jordan of your sport. You can do one thing, or Serena Williams of your sport, and you can do one thing really well. These 6 CEOs, these CEOs can spin 6 responsibilities and do them all at very high levels all the time. So that's one thing that really stood out. The second is they are remarkable integrators. Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, said to us in our interview, he said, when you kind of think about it, it's an information asymmetry problem. As a CEO, you see more than anyone in your organization sees. And you certainly see more than the 10 or 12 people on the board that you report to. So your level of integration there's a huge premium on the level of integration, bringing it all together because of this information asymmetry problem. So that's the second thing you see, is these CEOs are great integrators. And then the final piece, which is really what the book is anchored on, is these CEOs along these 6 responsibilities have these 6 amazing mindsets. And a lot of the book is dedicated to these mindsets. And these mindsets really separate truly excellent CEOs, in my view, from the rest. And we can dig into any of the mindsets as and when you choose.
Well, yeah. So we don't have time in this venue to really dive deeply into all 6, right? In fact, you all need a copy of the book. So we are talking again to Vikram Malhotra, the co-author of the book CEO Excellence. And so you're going to want to get a copy. And if you aren't already convinced, you will be before we're done. So we don't have time to talk about all 6, Vic. But why don't you give us 2 or 3 to give up people a flavor, and then maybe tell us a story from one of those 67 CEOs that might help to illustrate one of those.
Absolutely. So one of the responsibilities of the CEO is to set the direction of the company, right? And in setting the direction of the company, the mindset that we call out is be bold. Too many CEOs come in, follow, they're in well-running organizations, they follow other successful CEOs, and their inclination is to try and take the company to the next level. But in essence, what they end up being is fairly incremental in what they do. And what we saw with these excellent CEOs was they were bold. They were very, very bold. They were bold in reimagining the vision of the company and where you might take it. They were bold in terms of the moves that they made in terms of programmatic M&A, for example. They were bold in their segment and customer strategies, and they were bold in how they thought about resource allocation and how they allocated against important opportunities, capital dollars or expense dollars or talent, right? So that was one responsibility and one mindset. A second responsibility is organizational alignment. And the mindset here was really treat the soft stuff as the hard stuff. So they think about culture and talent just like they think about budgeting and delivery of financial numbers, which is they put measurements against it, they put metrics against it, they measure it, they role model it, they hold themselves and others accountable for it. So they treat the soft stuff as the hard stuff. And then they're amazing, just a third responsibility, and I'll stop there, and then we'll be happy to go into some examples. Take top team alignment. The mindset there is really understand the team psychology so that your focus here is on creating not a team of stars, but a star team. And they're very focused on how you create a star team. So those just give you a flavor of some of the responsibilities and how it translates into mindsets.
Well, I'm really glad that you picked that third one, because I think that while all of the 6 mindsets certainly apply to any of us as leaders, the context is different, perhaps, and that sort of thing. But I think each of them apply. And I thought, especially in that section of the book, it was really clear how that would be true for us at all levels. And in working with leaders for many years as well, I see that often that's a challenge, that people have a hard time with that. So maybe do you have an example? Let's stay in that one, in that area around understanding and thinking about team psychology. maybe an example from the book, or even maybe one that's not, that you want to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I would if you kind of look at um, Brad Smith, who was the former CEO of Intuit. Um, he did three remarkable things in that whole area of team psychology. The first was a absolute conviction that a team is not a team if it's a team of stars, but it's a team if it's a star team, right? And what Brad would say to us is, look, you cannot have a person on the team who is you cannot have a person on the team who is basically outstanding at what they do, outstanding in their business unit or in their function, but they can't get along and can't work with others. It just doesn't work, right? You got to kind of bring them together, and you got to make them all work together. So he was big on this notion of you create a star team, not a team of stars. He was also big on the notion of you have to coach players. So one of the things he said, one of the things he actually said to us, which I thought was really interesting, was, I kind of lived under this impression that great CEOs exit all the C players and the B players and even the B plus players, and they're just looking to get a bunch of A players on their team. Not true. What Brad would say is, yes, you got to exit the C players. Maybe you got to exit the B players, but your job is to coach the B plus players to become A minus players, and it's your job to coach the A minus players to become A players. So a real focus on that coaching equation there, right? And the final piece around really bringing the team together was you got to create process around it. So you got to have an operating rhythm in terms of how often they come together, the time they spend together, the offsites they spend together, how they get to know each other. So if you don't have process around it, if you don't have operating rhythm around it, you can't get the team to really function as a team.
So
that would
yeah, that's a great one, and I'm glad that you brought the operating rhythm piece up, because I think that's really, really important, and also often forgotten, or doesn't take sort of the level of get the level of attention that it ought to get. But you're really doing something here in this conversation that I think the book does a great job of. And I just like you talk about it in general. It's everyone will say, well, mindset's important, but what you're talking a lot about is how do you translate, and you just did it in the example, Vic, of translating mindset into practice. So here's here's how I'm thinking, here's how I'm turning that into practice. So can you just talk about that sort of reality of how what does that mean to you when you say go from mindset to practice, and sort of how do we do that?
Yeah, I'm going to try and illustrate it through a couple of examples, if I may, please, Kevin. So let's take the earlier mindset I was talking about: set direction and be bold. Okay, well, to be bold, you got to actually translate into action. So the example I'm going to use here is Ajay Banga at MasterCard. So when Ajay Banga takes over MasterCard, the whole mantra is beat Visa, beat American Express, be the best payments company in the world that you can be. He actually looked around, and bear in mind, this was 2010 or 2011, not 2022. He looked around and he said, we're talking about beating people who are operating in 10% of the market. 90% of all transactions are still in cash, right? And so he reframed the opportunity as kill cash. And once you do that, then that starts translating into, okay, if I'm going to do that, now I've got to invest deeply behind what was then a pretty nascent debit card business. I've got to invest deeply behind the debit card business. I've got to disproportionately put money against that. I've got to be willing to cannibalize some of my credit card revenues, which are higher margin than debit card, to go down that journey. I'm going to have to take some hits in my earnings, but eventually it's all going to pay off. And it did for him, right? So that would be an example that in that arena. Another wonderful area that I love is this whole area of culture, because what many of these great CEOs do is they pick one element of culture and say, we're really going to transform the company on that cultural dimension. So here the mindset was, if you recall, was you treat the soft stuff as the hard stuff. So take Kaz Hirai at Sony. He comes in and his strategy is geared in this notion of kando. Kando in Japanese, loosely translated, is the wow factor. And what he wanted to do was bring back the wow factor to electronics and to music and to entertainment and the whole lot. And what that really meant was higher quality products, better customer experience. And then he starts translating that. He starts measuring it and monitoring it, and really making it come to life, because he's putting some hard metrics against it, and he's role modeling it, and he's talking about it all the time. So just a couple of examples about how people took big concepts, but eventually made it real for the company.
For everybody, right? And so some of us might be listening and say, well, yeah, but I'm not leading Sony, I'm not leading Microsoft, I'm not leading Intuit. And yet all of that stuff applies if we're leading our team and still
Absolutely.
driving that into practices. So, you know, the book just came out as we're having this conversation. It's been out a couple of weeks. So those who are listening to a podcast later, in the middle of March of 2022. And one of the things that you did as you did some of your metrics, you measured metrics through 2019 because you didn't want to worry about what the pandemic did or didn't do to some of your analysis. But now we're in 2022, and the pandemic, we think, is hopefully almost over, but the world of work has changed forever.
Completely.
And so my question for you would be, how would you, what do you think about the level of nuance now? Like, if we were to look at this stuff again in 5 years, like which of, I'll do it this way. Which of the mindsets do you think become perhaps even more important now as the world of work is changing?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. Now, even though the metrics only ran through 2019, fortunately, most of these interviews were done in 2021. So we were in the heart of the pandemic,
right.
While the interviews were going on. Look, I think the single biggest change that has occurred, and will, well, maybe two big pieces of change. One very big piece of change that has occurred relative to 10 years ago, and I think will continue to change dramatically, is this whole area of connecting with stakeholders and the time and energy that CEOs have to spend against that. It used to be that they used to spend about 10% of their time there. Today, they're spending up to 30% of their time there. Some of them even up to 50% of their time there. Now, some of this is planned interactions with regulators and trade unions and investors and analysts and all of that stuff. But as we can tell, for a number of CEOs, given all the pressures of social media and given all the turbulence in the world, a lot of this is unplanned time that they're spending, which relates to everything from social unrest to war to the pandemic, right? So you have lots and lots of things that create demands on you in unexpected and quick ways that there's no way you can plan for it, but you got to kind of react and deal with in the moment, right? That's very specific to the CEO. The other piece that you've rightly pointed out that has changed dramatically is the nature of work, and what will the post-pandemic work paradigm mean? What will it mean in terms of remote work? What will it mean in terms of behaviors in the workplace? And I think most of these CEOs, even the excellent ones, would say it's a work in progress. We just don't know. They're all experimenting. They're all trying different things. They're all trying to think about a mix of in-person versus remote. How does it apply to certain teams versus other teams? Even when you're in person, how do you change your behaviors in terms of how you actually work in your workspace? How do you use your workspaces differently? The best are all in some version of experimentation at this point, and all still to be sorted out. And they're paying a lot of attention to it.
Well, and I think that goes back to your first point, which was spending more time with connecting with stakeholders, and of course, their employees are one of those stakeholders.
Big stakeholders.
And so, even though you framed that a little bit around all of the other issues in our world and the rapid change in our world, I think that applies very much to,
yes,
if the workplace is different, then the need for them to stay connected inside the organization will be different than it's ever been before. And I think you're right in terms of how that will play out is still to be determined. And by the way, we now have people telling us hello from the Maldives and from Brazil. So we got people everywhere listening in now, and we're so glad that all of you are here. So if any of you have a question for Vic and I that you want to share, feel free to do that as we continue this conversation. So I said we would come back to this idea, Vic, that while the book says CEO excellence on it, and the example and the research comes from talking with truly excellent on many dimensions CEOs. You said it's really a leadership book, to which I would agree as a reader. What are the lessons here for non-CEOs? Like, what are a couple of things that you would highlight for non-CEOs for us to be thinking about?
Yeah, yeah. So, uh, of all the things that are in the book, I really kind of look at all the pieces around engaging with the board, and maybe some of the stuff that the CEO has to do with connecting with stakeholders externally as sort of the stuff that's due to come in due course. But much of the rest of it applies. So, for example, this whole notion of set the direction and be bold, we can do that no matter what leadership role we're in. That mindset of boldness, the mindset of how do you think and get into all the aspects of the vision, the boldness in your actions, resource allocation, all of that plays through. This whole notion of aligning the organization, no matter how big or small your team is, some of the things that many of these great CEOs do from a cultural point of view, how they think about talent, how they think about how they deploy their key talent and resources in good ways, all of that applies. Certainly the team psychology piece that you and I talked about, again, no matter how big or small a team, absolutely applies. But perhaps the biggest piece that applies is one we haven't touched upon yet, which is your personal operating model. I mean, one of the things you learn from these great CEOs is they're amazing when it comes to time management and how they manage their calendar and the tips and tricks that they use for managing their calendar, how they manage their energy, right? How they manage their energy. That's another big part of their own operating model that comes into play, which really ends up being a series of sprints rather than either a sprint or a marathon. It's just a series of sprints with a lot of recovery in between. And then, frankly, how they manage their leadership style, right? They tend to be more servant leader in their orientation rather than top-down dictatorial. And I think kind of their behaviors, how they live their authentic self, there's some real learnings in there that I think are applicable to each and every one of us.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. We have a question that came in, and it's interesting. This question that came in, I'm going to put it up here in a second. And the question is being asked to two people who do this. So here's the question. Well, how important is it for CEOs to invest in a coach? You might get a biased answer here from the two of us, but no, I think it's a valuable question, and then we could probably extend it beyond just CEOs. But what's your take on that, Vic?
I think the short answer is very important, and I think I have good news to report on this, which is, for the most part, every one of these CEOs, not everyone, but for many of them, they had some version of a coach. Now, it may not always be of the perfect definition of the kind of coach that links in here in the way that we normally think about coaches, but they always had a small group of people they relied on. Some of it was, your kind of traditional coach. For others, there might be someone within the organization who's a confidant, a consigliere, if you like. For others, they leaned on someone externally, a lawyer, a banker, a consultant, a friend. By the way, interesting how many of them actually took the counsel of their spouse or partner as someone who gave them advice. So they get their advice from a small group, and many of them have coaches in the way that you traditionally think of. And I think getting that input is incredibly important for them. Incredibly important.
Well, I've said for a long time that being a leader at any level is sort of a lonely thing, because so many people that are around you don't understand that situation. And the higher you go, the more true that becomes, right?
Absolutely.
You're the CEO, man. There's a whole lot of people that don't really understand all of the stuff, all of that integration that we were talking about, and the nature of all six of those roles, as we were talking about. I think that's absolutely true. So if someone who is watching or listening is saying, well, that's the trajectory I'm on, right? I'm headed for the C-suite. Either I've been told that, or that's just where I'm headed, right? That's where I want to be headed. Or even if I'm just wanting to be a better leader, what would be your advice today, Vic, before we start to change course and finish this conversation up? What would be your advice then? Where should they start? What would you do? What would you encourage people to do today?
You mean other than read the book?
Well, of course, they should all, of course, read the book. Here we go. Well done, my friend.
Look, I think I think the way that you start is by adopting some version of these mindsets. Not all of them, but perhaps some version of them. And I would particularly call out this mindset, particularly on whatever arena you're in. Learn how to be bold, right? As Satya Nadella tells this interesting story, again, back to the CEO of Microsoft, when he took over from Steve Ballmer, Ballmer said to him, you can, if you're incremental, you'll be gone in a couple of years. If you're bold and you get it wrong, you'll be gone in a couple of years. So you may as well be bold and get it right. So the more practice you can have at being bold and getting it right. And, the boldness does come with, you got to make the right trade-offs from a risk point of view and a resource allocation point of view and all of that stuff, right? So I don't mean to imply boldness means go crazy, right? But I think the more you can kind of work on this mindset of being bold, I think the more you can work on this mindset of solving for the team psychology and creating top team alignment, the more you can work on your own operating model around do only what you can do and managing your time and energy. I think those three mindsets of the 6 are a great starting point for anyone in any walk of life, no matter where they are.
Perfect. I love that. So I do want to shift before we finish and ask you a couple of other things that sort of take us away, if you will, from the important and serious nature of what we've been talking about. And I'm just going to ask you, like, Vic, what do you do for fun? This is not supposed to be a hard question.
No. I was kind of thinking of all the many things I like to do for fun. So I'm a travel fiend. Not as much as my co-author Scott Keller, who's been to every single country in the world, by the way. So if you want an interesting man, there he is. But I love exotic travel. The pandemic has been a real blow to the heart because I would be in 5 or 8 different countries a year, just kind of absorbing the culture and understanding the places. And so I love to travel. And I love playing golf. That probably comes with my age, but I've certainly in my older age just absorbed golf. So in the summer, you're more likely to see me out on the golf course than talking about my book for sure.
All right. Well, I'm glad we got you now then. So speaking of books, if we were speaking about a book other than yours, the question would be like, what are you reading right now? Yeah. Or what's something, Vic, that you've read recently that people might find interesting?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you a pretty boring answer here, Kevin, and I'll apologize ahead of time. But I went back to a book that 3 of my colleagues wrote called Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick. And what was interesting was as we did all this work, I'd read this book, of course, when it first came out about 3 years ago. And when we did all this work, one of the co-authors said, a lot of the things you're talking about great CEOs doing, we wrote about back in 2016 or 17 or whenever they published the book. So I figured I owed it to them to go back and read it. And they were right. They have some very interesting lessons and it kind of marries well with the book. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a boring answer, but if I'm honest with you, that is what I have been reading recently.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. So now the question you've been wanting me to ask really from the beginning, and that is, where can people learn more about you, the work? Where can people get the book? Anything you want to say about that? I'll hold the book up while you do that.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I might give you two quick tips on this one. Firstly, if you go to McKinsey.com, there is a whole section dedicated to the book. And in particular, it's got 6 or 7 videos that give you a little bit of kind of author talks, if you like, on the book. Each of the authors also have their own little author talks about themselves, their families, and the like. So McKinsey.com is clearly an area you can go to. And by the way, right from there, from the page about the book, you've got links to 5 different sites if you actually want to go buy the book, of course. Otherwise, you can just go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble and the like, and there it is. There it is. But McKinsey.com, going to the CEO Excellence book page, will give you an awful lot more on the book and some, I think, quite nicely produced videos that'll help too.
Perfect. Vic, thank you so much. Before I let you go, and before I let all the rest of you go, now I have the question that I ask all of you who are watching or listening every single week, and that now, the most important question of all, now what? What are you going to do with this? Well, there are plenty of things that you got today. You heard about 6 mindsets. I think we got to all 6 before we were done. We talked about the idea of how do you move from mindset to practice. Maybe the lesson for you is very simply about how do I work on being bolder. Maybe that's the single mindset we talked about the most, but it's any number of things. Maybe it's thinking about how do you apply and think about culture in your team, regardless, whether we're talking about macro culture like a CEO or micro culture like an individual leader. There are plenty of things here for us to act on. It's not my job to tell you which one it is, but it is my job to remind you that if you don't take action, none of it at the end of the day will matter at all. Vic, thanks so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you. I've been looking forward to it. I love the book, and it was a pleasure to have you.
Well, Kevin, thank you. I really, really appreciate your time, and thanks for having me on the show.
Everybody, if you've ever been here before, we'll be back every week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I hope you'll join us then, and tell a friend and have them join us as well. Thanks, everybody.